Monks and Marshes, a talk on Medieval Westminster by Gillian Staples, adapted from a talk by Alison Kenny. The majority of people walking around the area of Westminster Abbey will not realise that they are actually on an island. Thorny Island marks the exit point of the tributaries of the River Tyburn where it meets the Thames. Naturally, the silty island, measuring around 30 acres, was covered in thorny thickets, much prone to flooding. It was first inhabited in the Iron Age, but archaeological evidence has been found of Roman dwellings and outbuildings. There were no bridges across this part of the Thames until Westminster Bridge was built in 1750. London Bridge was the nearest crossing point, and Thames watermen with their barges and the horse ferry owned by the Archbishops of Canterbury were the only options to reach the other side. Even by the mid-16th century, Westminster was still largely rural, with isolated settlements. Buildings ran west from the City of London along the Strand and down Whitehall to Westminster Abbey and the Palace of Westminster. These roads were the first connections between these two areas. There were lodgings for MPs and courtiers along the route, and Tothill fields were used for pasture and agriculture. Even our beloved royal parks looked very different. It's thought that they were home to deer, boar and wild bulls in the Middle Ages. Green Park, Hyde Park and St James's Park were all enclosed by Henry VIII and mainly used by the king as hunting grounds. Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries abolished the Abbey at Westminster. In 1540, the church became a cathedral and the Diocese of Westminster was formed. City status was granted, but both the diocese and the city status were then abolished in 1550. Westminster kept its city as a courtesy title until 1900, when Westminster City Council was created and the area was fully established as a city once again. A lot of the early history of Westminster is centred on the Abbey. According to the monk Sulcard, the first church on the site was built by Cerbert, king of the East Saxons, in circa 605 AD. The name Westminster was given to the church as it was, quite simply, the minster west of the City of London. The city had St Paul's, so Westminster was dedicated to St Peter. The 785 Charter of Offa, King of Mercia, implies that he founded a monastic community at Westminster. However, the first monastery was believed to have been founded by Dunstan, Archbishop of Canterbury. He restored the church, which had suffered damage by the Danish invaders in 893 AD, but it suffered more damage during the reign of Ethelred the Unready, when London surrendered to Svein Forkbeard, King of the Danes, in 1013. 3 years later, Ethelred's death saw his kingdom divided up and King Canute was given the monastery. It is believed he was the first monarch to live in Westminster. This is just the start of Westminster Abbey's long connection with royalty. Edward the Confessor rebuilt the original Saxon church in 1065 in response to the Pope's request for him to found or restore a church to St Peter. There are no remains of Edward's Abbey above ground. After Edward's death and burial in the church, William I took to the throne and his coronation was the first to be held at the Abbey. All monarchs since then have followed suit, with the exceptions of Edward V and Edward VIII, who were never crowned. The Coronation Chair has formed a large part of the coronation tradition. Created on the order of Edward I in 1300, it encases the stone of Scone and the ornate oak chair has been used for all coronations since. Edward's church stood for about 200 years, until in the mid-13th century Henry III decided to rebuild it. Early English style was influenced by French Gothic architecture, which is seen in many English and French cathedrals of this period. The scale of the project was huge, and Henry died before it was completed. As well as coronations, the medieval period saw the Abbey established as the resting place for the monarchs. Henry III wanted to elevate Edward the Confessor's presence in the church and created an ornate and Italian-crafted tomb for him. For hundreds of years after, many of the kings and queens of England were laid to rest or had monuments erected to them in the Abbey, but the tradition eventually ceased with the lack of space. Richard II also allowed great commoners to be buried and commemorated in the Abbey, which included statesmen, soldiers, scientists, engineers, architects, actors, poets, and more. In 1400, Geoffrey Chaucer became the first poet to be buried in Poets' Corner in the south transept. Another medieval establishment was that of Westminster School. It evolved from a school of clergy attached to the Abbey. In 1540, the dissolution of the monasteries put the operation of the school into question, but Henry VIII ensured its survival and it was refounded by Elizabeth I in 1560. Aspects of the medieval school are still used to this day. Abbot Littlington's dining hall, built in 1369 to 1376, is still used as the school's refectory. On the riverfront, the Palace of Westminster, built by Edward the Confessor, was the main royal palace until Henry VIII's Whitehall Palace was built. When Henry moved out, the building remained home of political decision-making, but it was almost destroyed by fire in 1834. Westminster Hall, which still stands today, was one of the few parts to survive. Built in 1097, the 240-foot-long and 40-foot-high hall was the creation of Rufus, son of William I. He dismissed it as a mere bedchamber compared to what he had planned to be built. It was restored by Edward II after a fire and altered for Richard II with higher walls and an oak hammer beam roof. Archaeological research suggests that this roof is self-supporting and it is the widest unsupported span in England. In 1920, it was reinforced with steel. From the 13th century, the hall was used as law courts, but it also witnessed many major royal events, including the abdication of Edward II, the deposition of Richard II, the trials of Anne Boleyn and Charles I, and many coronation festivals. The only other surviving medieval part of the original Palace of Westminster is the Jewel Tower. Built from 1365 to 1366, it can still be visited today. Its original purpose was to hold royal treasure and was known as the King's Privy Wardrobe. At the end of the 16th century, it was repurposed to store parliamentary records, and then, in 1869, the tower became home to the Standard Weights and Measures Department. This department had to vacate the building in 1938 after the increase in size and number of vehicles in the road outside was creating noise and vibrations inside, jeopardising the precision required in their work. The medieval period saw Whitehall established as the part of the main thoroughfare between the City of London and Westminster. Early finds include the remains of a 9th century Saxon wooden hall used for spinning, weaving and grinding corn, which were discovered on the site of the Treasury Green area. An 8th century Saxon sword has also been found near the Palace of Westminster. Great Scotland Yard on the south side of Whitehall is associated in most people's minds with the Metropolitan Police Headquarters, which originally backed out onto this road. However, the road's name reveals more about its origins. It was the location of a house given by King Edgar to Kenneth III of Scotland in 959 AD, and though not an official embassy, it was the London home of Scottish royalty. Henry VIII's sister, Margaret, married to James IV, was the last Scottish royal to live there. The Strand formed the second part of this thoroughfare to the City of London. The road was a pre-Roman track and by 1185 was called Strand. The road starts at Temple Bar and runs to Charing Cross. In the 13th century, Charing Cross was just a hamlet, marked by a cross to Queen Eleanor, wife of Edward I. It stood where Charles I's statue stands today, from 1290 until 1647, with a replica placed in front of the forecourt of the station by A.S. Barry in 1863. The south side of the Strand was also home to a number of medieval palaces, many of which originally belonged to the bishops and were taken over by the royal family and noble courtiers in the 16th century. These included York House, home to the Bishop of Norwich, Durham House, home of the Bishops of Durham, Worcester House, home of the Bishops of Carlisle, and Essex House, the outer temple of the Knights Templar. They changed hands many times, and most were demolished to make way for housing developments in the mid to late 17th century. Somerset House is possibly the most well-known of all the Strand palaces, though it was also rebuilt in the 17th century. It still stands prominently alongside the Thames today. Though not standing anymore, the grandest of all the medieval palaces was the Savoy Palace. In 1246, Henry III granted the land for the palace to Queen Eleanor's uncle, Peter, Count of Savoy. Residents of the palace included the Earls of Lancaster and his descendants, the Dukes of Lancaster. In 1361, it was inherited by John of Gaunt and is subsequently targeted by Wat Tyler during the Peasants' Revolt, as they blamed John for the introduction of the poll tax. In 1512, Henry VII founded the Hospital of St John at the palace. Originally a hospital for the poor, it was requisitioned for use as a military hospital during the Civil War, and after this, parts of the site were later repurposed for other military uses, including a prison. Also on the site of the hospital was the chapel. The original Savoy Chapel was destroyed in 1381 and rebuilt with the hospital. It later became a place of worship for nonconformist French Protestants. A number of fires in the 19th century prompted many phases of rebuilding, but the chapel still stands today and is known as the Queen's Chapel of the Savoy. Medieval monasteries were incredibly important. As well as owning more land than the king, they formed an integral part of people's daily lives, not only with religious direction, but medical care and support for the poor. St Mary Roncesvalles was founded at Charing Cross in 1199 by Augustinian canons. They were given land by William Marshall, Earl of Pembroke, to build a hospital. In 1544, the hospital was dissolved, and a few years later the site was given to Sir Thomas Cordon between 1608 and 1613. Northampton House, later Northumberland House, was built nearby. The chapel was demolished and the bodies reinterred at St Martin's. The rest of the site became a private house until its demolition in 1705. Another important medieval institution was St James's Leper Hospital. The hospital was dedicated to St James the Less and thought to have been founded by the citizens of London, as leper hospitals were often placed outside of a town's centre. The hospital was controlled by the Abbey and believed to have been home to 14 or 16 leper women with 8 brothers living under quasi-monastic rule. The hospital eventually opened up to non-leper patients, and after a string of scandals, a murder, and the Black Death, the hospital was abandoned in 1353. It was reclaimed in 1386, changing hands a number of times, and in 1536 was a retirement home for 4 fairly wealthy almswomen. The site was taken by Henry VIII for St James's Palace, and it is said that the burial ground of the lepers is in Green Park. A number of Westminster churches have medieval origins. Much like the monasteries, the church played an incredibly important role in people's everyday lives. St Clement Danes on the Strand was reputedly given to the defeated Danes by King Alfred in the late 10th century. The nearby St Mary le Strand was founded in 1147 as the Church of the Nativity of Our Lady and Innocents. It was demolished in 1549 for Somerset House, temporarily housed in the Savoy Chapel, and relocated to a new church in 1717. St Martin in the Fields, a 12th century chapel, became a new church in 1222. St Margaret's, housed in the grounds of Westminster Abbey, was founded in the mid-12th century by Abbot of Westminster. The first church was demolished in the reign of Edward III, and though rebuilt and frequently restored, the Duke of Somerset planned to demolish it, but the parishioners rioted against the decision. In 1614, it became the official church of the House of Commons. Slightly further afield, St Marylebone Parish Church served the medieval manors of Lisson and Tyburn. The first church was built in the area where Marble Arch is now, in around 1200. This was the church of St John Tyburn of Oxford Street at the end of Marylebone Lane. In circa 1400, crime was so bad that the parishioners moved north to a new church in the High Street, which was dedicated to Our Lady of Tyburn, hence the name St Mary by the Bourne. The medieval building was replaced in 1740 with a modest structure on the same site. The fast-growing local population required a bigger church, and the current church was built in Marylebone Road in 1813. The former, but still relatively new church on the High Street was demoted to a parish chapel and demolished in 1949. Trade in medieval times was heavily controlled by the Crown. The oldest record in our archive collections is the grant from Henry III of 1256, permitting a weekly market on Tot Hill and the annual St Magdalen Fair also to be held on Tot Hill Fields, which was held in the reign of Edward III until the late 16th century. As you would probably imagine, medieval Westminster was also rife with crime. The presence of rich MPs, courtiers, and the Abbey pilgrims attracted thieves. The narrow medieval streets and rookeries provided perfect spots for robbers to pounce on their victims, though criminals were given sanctuary if they were within the precincts of the Abbey, hence the roads Broad Sanctuary and Little Sanctuary. One of the arguments behind the creation of Victoria Street in the mid-19th century was to demolish these little roads and create a safe thoroughfare. Broad Sanctuary was also home to the Gatehouse Prison. Built in 1370 by Walter de Warfield, it was used to hold robbers, felons and trespassers, and in 1618 Sir Walter Raleigh was imprisoned there. Many criminals in the area that were sentenced to death met their fate at Tyburn Gallows, found at the junction of Edgware Road and Oxford Street. It was the location of public hangings from 1388 to 1783. And finally, to groundbreaking invention. William Caxton, the first English printer, established his printing press at Westminster in 1477. He learned his trade in Bruges and once set up in Westminster printed 107 books. These included the Canterbury Tales in 1478 and Morte d'Arthur in 1485. He lived near Chapter House on the south side of the Abbey and later rented a house in Almany, which is now the corner of Great Smith Street and Victoria Street. After dying in 1491, his house was kept until 1500 by his assistant, Wynkyn de Worde, before he moved to Fleet Street.